Hello and welcome back to Unearth the Past, a brand new family history and genealogy podcast brought to you by me, Dr. Michala Hume. Seeing as this will be our 11th episode, I'm not quite sure I can keep saying brand new genealogy podcast. I might milk it for another couple and then I promise you I shall drop it and just say it's a genealogy podcast. So folks, this week, do you remember in week 1 I said to you that if you see this man loitering around you in a Macintosh coat, you've probably got dodgy ancestors? Yeah? Well, this week I am back with Paul McNeil and we are doing what he does best. And that is we are going to be going through our dodgy pasts. So this week we're going to be sharing with you our favourite stories from the criminal archive. Paul McNeil, thank you so much for coming on again. Have you had a good week? Have you been doing any research, anything interesting?
Yeah, funny enough, I did find a couple of criminal ancestors for a client. I'm at that point in doing their tree where I've almost finished it, and I'm writing it up, and it's going to be like 150 pages long or whatever. And I thought that's good. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I can see where we're getting to. And what I generally do is go back through it and look at some of the side branches of the family just to see if there's anything interesting in there before we finish it off. And guess what? There was something interesting. So this is going back to the 1860s, and I found a very, very well-dressed, very well-presented young lady who was going into jewellery shops and asking to see items of jewellery, generally gold chains. They would bring them out to her. She would look at the gold chain. She would say she liked it or didn't like it. Anyway, send it back. And she said, I might come back for that later. And she'd go off. And then later on, they'd find that what she's done is swapped it for a brass chain or something like that. And she went on from that. She graduated from that to doing coining. She took up with a guy from an ex-soldier, and he had a little coining set up where he just did like 4-penny pieces and things like that, small amounts. And they were sending her sister out to pass these coins, and the sister made the mistake of admitting she'd done it. They all denied it. They got away with it. The sister got a sentence for it. So all this came out of nowhere, all from the back streets of Walworth somewhere.
Wow.
And there's no history in the family of any real wrongdoing before that. And it's the women, which is unusual.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating, but it was written up in the newspapers. She did at least 3 jewellery shops that we know of, possibly a lot more. And she was basically a professional criminal one way or another.
So I have been researching this week. I've been focusing on genetic genealogy. Wow. Yeah, it's a week of my life I can't get back. I've been learning about different theories and, how you can figure out using these different theories. It can give you maybe slightly more accurate results, when we're looking at DNA matches and how people are related to you. So I've been doing that all week. I'd like to say it's been really exciting. It's not. It's been one of the driest things I've ever done in genealogy. However, it's now done. I have enough knowledge that I'm going to try it out next week on a tree that I've been working on, which I have DNA for, so I'm going to cross-reference it. So I'm going to try it out next week. But it's been a very long research week for me because of that, Paul. It's felt like this week has gone on forever. I can't wait to see the back of it and do something fun next week. Anyway, so this week...
It's your own fault. It's your own fault for having a proper job. You should be like me, be a person of leisure. Don't have a proper job.
Oh, I know. And normally, like whenever we do these podcasts, because the weather's been nice, Paul's been outside bit of chest on show, normally a wine glass in his hand, living the dream on the south coast, where I've been cooped up in my office. I do like my office; it is a nice office, but nevertheless I've been cooped up in my office, and Paul's been outside sunning himself, looking all bronzed. Anyway, this week we're both inside because the weather's took a turn. So let's start then with thinking about our criminal ancestors, and we are going to share some of our favourite stories that we have researched and discovered from the past. But before we do that, it's probably worth talking a bit about the criminal justice system and how it looked in the 18th, 19th and into the 20th century, and also a bit about the criminal records that you can get online and also in the records office. So to start with then, folks, if you committed a crime in the 18th century and it was a fairly minor offence, you wouldn't have been taken to some formal courtroom and tried in front of a judge and a jury. You would have been in the parlour room of the local magistrate, or even maybe in a side room off a pub. You would go in there and you would stand in front of the magistrate and you would hear your charges, and then he would pass sentence. And that is how most of the cases happened in the 18th century, especially for those minor cases. As the century progressed and we move into the 19th century, we do start to get formal courts, and they're known as the petty sessions. For these are small crimes. I would say, Paul, and you will probably agree with me, that if you have a look in the newspaper at the petty sessions and what is going on in these smaller courtrooms, you get really interesting and sometimes slightly obscure cases that are heard at these petty sessions. And the early court system, it was chaos. It wasn't this sort of real strict regimented system that we have in play today. The courtroom, honestly, was bonkers. It would have been crammed full of people. It would have just been chaos. Have you enjoyed looking at the petty sessions, Paul? You know, in the newspapers? I know I have. And it's, as I say, it's often where the minor offences are heard.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you never know what you're going to find. And you get weird stuff in there. You get people cross-examining each other. So you get, the defendant arguing with someone that's brought evidence against him and things like this, and questioning each other. You get some amazing stuff. You get things like, someone will be taken by the local policeman and taken to a magistrate because he's been found driving a sheep down the street and he doesn't think it's his. And when they go back to his house, he's got 3 sheep in the back bedroom hidden because he's been rustling the sheep one at a time and this kind of thing. So you just never know what you're going to find. You find some tragic things in there as well, but some of the things are just hilarious. I mean, we'll talk about the redknaps later on, but they were so litigious and they were in court so much over hundreds, literally, of years, and they got so accustomed to it that they were having the court in fits. And when you see it reported in the papers, they say, where the jury are laughing or where the magistrate are laughing because of what's been said. So I think they're a minor information.
So we have the petty sessions. That is where the minor offences are heard, and that is where there's no jury needed. And they dealt with the most number of cases. So Clive Emsley, who is a fabulous historian, and if you are interested in looking at the court system in the 19th century, do check out his work. But he said that in 1857, the justices in the petty sessions had to deal with 20 times the number of cases dealt by all the other courts combined. So they were dealing with 20 times more cases than by the other courts. Now, the other court systems that were in play during the 19th century were the quarter sessions, and they are exactly what they say on the tin. So they were held every quarter, and these were for more more major cases. And this is where people were prosecuted on indictment. So that is a document which contained the charge. Now, if it was a really serious offence, the quarter sessions, a bit like our magistrates, I suppose that's the best way to think about it. The quarter sessions could refer the perpetrators straight over to the assize courts, which is like our Crown Court. And the assize courts is where the big cases were heard. So these are things like, like your murder charges. And that's where you would be in front of a jury. And the judges who actually presided at these assize courts were on a circuit. For example, there was a Lancashire circuit, a southeastern circuit, a North Wales circuit. There were only 2 assize courts in the year, so there wasn't an opportunity for people to be tried in the assize courts throughout the year. And for a lot of people, especially, if you were working class, it was actually very difficult for you to try somebody at court. Because don't forget, at this time, a lot of people who went to court, they were not being taken to court by the police. It was private prosecutions. But if you were a working class person, you had to basically take the time off work. You had to, because you didn't know, by the way, when your case was going to come up at the assize courts, and the assize courts could last for a few days. You would just have to turn up and wait. You would also have to hope that your witnesses could afford to take the time off work. Because at this point, nobody's paying them for their time. They're not getting paid as a witness. So, and also, you probably couldn't afford somebody to represent you, a solicitor, a barrister, whatever. So you're going to represent yourself. So for working class people to actually bring prosecutions was very, very difficult. But that is just a sort of an overview of the court system in the 18th and the 19th century. So by the end of the 19th century, we do see more prosecutions being brought by the police force, because by the end of the 19th century, the police force, pardon the pun, is more uniformed and more professional and more organised, and they are bringing a lot more prosecutions. But if we move to the beginning of the 19th century, most prosecutions were brought by individuals, mostly men, by the way. It didn't really favour women at this time. Paul, criminal records. Where is the best place to go to get criminal records? Or where would you say, if you had a criminal ancestor, what records have been most useful in your research?
Well, funnily enough, it's often easiest to find a record of someone that's broken the law by searching the newspapers. If you start with that, there's so many of them that are still around. It's so easy to search on the names, etc., in an area. And things like petty sessions, all the records for those might not have survived, but the newspaper records probably have. So if they've done anything serious, it'll be in a newspaper. Even if they've done something fairly minor, it might be in the newspaper. If they're funny, when they're before a magistrate, it will probably be in the newspaper. So there's all kind of things that you can find in the newspapers to get you started. Once you've found that, you'll know the date of when they were tried. You'll probably know the date of the magistrate. The name of the magistrate that tried them. And you know the location. So then you start to be able to get into other records. And, you go into Ancestry, you go into Find My Past, and, you go into various archives online. And there's an absolute ton of different indices that you can use to find it. UK calendar of prisoners. If they're committed to prison, you can find that 1848 to 1902. Things like England and Wales criminal registers. So if they haven't gone to prison, but they have had a fine or something like that, you can find their name, age, date of birth, the location of the trial, and sentence, and you can see original scans of it. You can then use that to move down into the UK Prisons Commission. So if they did get a custodial sentence, and you can look at their birth, their occupation, the usual stuff, charge and sentence. You can also see when they were admitted to jail and which jail they went to. And then you can then go back into the newspapers and try and find out about the case. So you can do it either way, but the easiest way to find a name is to go through the newspapers, I would say. That's generally the easiest way of finding someone. If you want more detail of what happened subsequently, then you go into an ancestry or Find My Past, something like that, and you start looking through their criminal registers, and there's lots on there.
As well, if we think about the records that they have, some of them have been really good. I mean, I looked at the women's prison records on, I think it was on Ancestry, and it was great because it gave you so much social history, and also it gave you learnt so much about the prisoner. I mean, the female convict records, I think that's their official title. I'll put a link in the description below. But not only do you get the name of your ancestor, you get a description of the person who you are looking for. You learn about their character or their perceived character in prison. You find out what they were up to while they were in prison, who wrote them, and often the letters are in there as well. And I think the saddest thing for me was when I was reading about one of the women, was that she was from Manchester, and I was reading about it, and she was getting regular letters from home, and they were quite, they were quite constant, getting letters from her husband, and then he just stopped writing to her. And I didn't find any evidence that he had died. He just stopped writing to her. And I don't know what had happened in terms of, I'm presuming, he had had enough. She was a repeat offender. And then when she came out and stayed in basically a women's institute in London. Not only do you get all this sort of descriptive stuff, you also get a photograph. Now, I love a good mugshot. I love a good mugshot. Honestly, Paul, I've written 2 books about crimes, about crime. And there's just something fascinating about a Victorian police mugshot. I don't know what it is. If ever I see it in a newspaper or on the internet, I have to stop, and I always want to read the story. I want to know, who is this person that has been in trouble. And I think especially because if you have working class ancestors, the chances are, you're not going to see them. If they're in the Victorian period, you're not going to see them because they probably couldn't afford to have their portrait taken. Yeah. So the fact that we get pictures of normal people, of working class people, is fascinating for me. And I love the mugshots.
Well, that's the thing, because most people, working class people, wouldn't have owned a camera before probably the late 30s or the early 50s even. And the first photograph you find in most trees of a working class family is when the guy was sent to the Western Front, for example, in the First World War, and he'd have his pictures taken before he went, because he didn't know if he was coming back or not. So that tends to be it. But if you've got the mugshots, it's interesting because they're very clear usually. They're on a big format when they were originally taken. They're very clear. And you can sort of look into the eyes of one of your own ancestors and think, okay, do I resemble them? Is that like me? How would I have felt? And a lot of them are young kids. A lot of them are 12 and 14 years old. And to see that, you see what they're wearing when they were arrested, this kind of thing. Do they look like a hardened criminal, or is this someone that is so poor that they've gone out and started nicking to make ends meet, kind of thing? So I think the other thing you get with some of these records, especially the prison records, is you get a physical description. So you start to get things like scars mentioned. If the guy's got a lot of scars on his knuckles, on his head and this sort of thing, some of the scars they describe, you can tell are razor cuts from when criminals would carry a razor rather than a knife, because you could cut someone with a razor and put them out of action without the risk of killing them. And professional criminals didn't want to kill people. That was going too far. It was too serious, so they would carry a razor. So you hear records of people with razor cuts on. It's like, okay, he may well have been in a gang, because that's how they would fight each other. And the other thing is, they tell you about tattoos. And that's interesting, because if you look at Victorian London in particular, quite often you'll find people with tattoos, and they have 5 dots on their arm, especially the men, but some of the women as well. and it'd be a sign you were in one of the South London gangs. And just 5 dots, like on a playing card, would be a sign that you're a gang member or are aspiring to be a gang member. So all of a sudden you start to see, okay, is he just this poor innocent, or is there a bit more to him, and maybe this is how he lives now. So I love those kind of records. Putting a face to it is like gold dust, isn't it?
So I want to take you back, Paul, to June 1828.
Okay.
And this was the first story that I researched when I was writing my Grim Almanac of Manchester book. And there was a group of children and they were playing on the streets of Ancoats. Now, if you go to Manchester you'll know that Ancoats is quite like a trendy place. It's one of them where you've got to be cool and not drink dairy products. Like a pizza's like 30 quid. And the houses that were once like slum terraces and a fortune. Back in the day, it was a really impoverished place to live, and the houses were terraces. Often you would get 2 or 3 families living in a house. Anyway, these group of children are playing in the streets when a woman approaches one of the children and she says to the child, "Look, I've baked a cake." I am paraphrasing slightly. I don't quite know what she said. "Look, I've baked a cake. I'll give you 2 sixpences if you go and deliver this cake to Mr. Drummond." And Mr. Drummond was the local flower seller. Obviously, the lad couldn't believe his luck. So he went and knocked on to the house, the Drummond house, and Mrs. Drummond answered the door. And he handed over the cake and he said, I've been given this cake. I've been told to pass it on to you. And it's come from a lady called Mrs. McCann. Anyway, Mrs. Drummond clearly thought this lad was being a bit dodgy. And she said, "Look, we don't know Mrs. McCann. Thank you very much. But we don't want your cake." So the lad went home with this cake. I don't quite know what cake it was, but it was it sounds like a big cake. Let's go for a fruit cake. I can't imagine it being a Victoria sponge. Yeah. So he takes the cake home and his mum thinks he's absolutely just made this story up, but she can't figure out where he's got the cake from. So she marches him round to Mrs. Drummond's house to check the story. Mrs. Drummond says, "Look, we don't know Mrs. McCann. We're not quite sure anything, where this cake's come from." So the young lad and his mum go off and take the cake. And his mum is a kind-hearted woman. So she cuts the cake up into pieces and starts handing it out to all the kids on the street and the neighbours. The cake is laced with arsenic. Oh. As soon as people start to swallow this cake, they start to become ill. Unfortunately, one of the children died as a result of arsenic poisoning because he swallowed the cake. So the hunt was on to find this mysterious Mrs. McCann, but all they had to go off was this young lad's description. And he said she was wearing a grey pinny. She was carrying a young baby. She had her hair tied up and she had sticky out front teeth. And that's all we've got to go on. And she was never found, Paul.
So I doubt they ever caught her, did they?
Never caught her and never knew why she wanted to poison the Drummond family, the local flower sellers. Don't know to this day.
I bet someone in the Drummond family knew at the time.
Possibly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I don't know, but never caught her. She is on my unsolved crimes list. There's quite a few on that list.
I was going to say.
She's on the unsolved crimes list.
Back in the day, trying to solve crimes, if you didn't catch them in the act or they weren't witnessed by several people just disappeared. So many serial killers must have been roaming the streets that just got away with it because the technology wasn't there to track them down. So
out of all the stories the criminal stories you've researched, what do you tell people if anybody asks you for a criminal story?
The obvious one that I'm always talking about is the one with the red naps, the one we did on DNA Journey, where he got away with the equivalent of £2.5 million. He was an excised man and worked in London, never had a criminal record, came from a respectable family, was posted up to Liverpool, and basically was working with the crews that would go on the ships before they docked. So they'd be waiting on the tides, waiting for a berth, and they could be on the ships for days. So these guys were going out to the ships and they were gambling, they were drinking, they were womanising, they were doing everything on these ships. But they were officially there to safeguard the taxes. So they had to safeguard the cargo that was on the ship to make sure nothing went on or off that ship before the government had their bite of the taxes from it. So that's what they were meant to do. But while they were there, they'd get bored, they would gamble, they would do this, they would do that. And what this guy's name, William Redknapp, what he did was he was a link between the men on the ships and the customs house in Liverpool. And he worked out that these guys are only being paid quarterly, so they had 3 months before they got any money through. And they were just spending it on and going through it. So he was lending them money, and he worked out that if they gave him their wage chits, he could go and collect their wages on their behalf, keep what they owed him, give the rest back to them. Then he found another angle to it, and he found a guy that used to run one of the parishes up there and was making lots of money from being a parish officer, basically, with building roads, looking after workhouses, creaming a little bit off the top. And basically Redknapp was going to him, borrowing money, lending it to these guys, getting their pay chips, then paying everybody off. So he was the man in the middle. And he waited till he had a really big payment coming through. So at the end of a quarter, they were going to get their wages. He then went to the moneylender as well, borrowed a huge amount of money off of him. So he'd been spending, months doing this very, very effectively and very honestly, always paying out what he had to pay out. But this one time, he took both lots of money, took his 6 kids, his wife, and their remarkably small black dog, according to the newspaper, jumped on a train, disappeared down to London. Now, it's a long story, and he got away with it, basically. And if you watch the DNA Journey episode with Flintoff and Redknapp, you'll see what happened. But he lived happily ever after with all this money. But the interesting thing was, from the point of view of tracing him, if you try to trace it in the normal records, you wouldn't find him. You wouldn't know it happened because he was never caught. And the way I found, so there was nothing to report other than the fact it was in the newspapers, and it was the newspapers that let me find out what he'd done. And there were mistranscriptions. So he did appear in a court case, but his name was mistranscribed. So he was in a court case between the moneylender and the guys he had lent money to, who had gone after him to try and find him, and then the moneylender tried to sue the Inland Revenue guys to get the money back off of them. And he was mentioned in it, but his name was wrong. And again, I only found it because it was in the newspapers. So it shows you, even if you do go for all the correct, court records and all this, if the guy got away with it, if he was never actually tried, there was no record. So that was a brilliant one. And the fact he got away with it, I just thought it was very funny. And it's very funny in the actual, the episode as well, because of the reactions from the Redknapps. But the beauty of the Red, the beauty of the Red.
Well, I was going to say, if you've not seen it, if you've not seen the episode, Paul, up to this point, if we just give people a bit of context, am I right by saying that it was Flintoff? I appear right at the end of this episode, by the way, literally just as the credits are about to go. But it was Flintoff who all the way through has had brushes, his ancestors had brushes with the law. Is that right? And so if you've watched the show, we won't give the end away, but
all sorts. And then when he saw this, he was quite made up at first, Freddie was, but then he realised it actually made Jamie's ancestors slightly more effective as criminals than his were. And he said, "You wouldn't even let me have that, would you?"
Have you got another story for us that is stuck in your memory bank?
Yeah, I mean, obviously a few of them are in DNA Journey, but I'll tell one that isn't. And there was a bloke called Alfred Walter Hagen, and
that sounds a very exotic name.
Well, it does. Yeah, it was probably a fairly normal name. It probably came from O'Hagan. It's probably an Irish name originally. And this guy was a soldier. His family were all soldiers. His father was a soldier. His mother obviously married his father, who then dumped her, and she went off with another soldier. So he had a sort of a fairly not harsh upbringing, but a hard upbringing. And he naturally went into the army with his brothers, and their mother for part of their lives brought them up on their own. And he was a really good soldier. He was a sergeant. He was posted out to India and to Burma. Took part in a number of campaigns out there. This is in about the 1880s, around about that time. Anyway, eventually left the army about 1890, came back to London, and was on a bit of a loose end. And he worked as a commissionaire, a doorman for a while, and then decided that wasn't for him. So he went off to America to try and find find a better life out there. And he didn't exactly find a better life out there, but he'd learned the value of applied violence. And when he came back to England a few years later, so this is about 1890, there was a pub in the Kingsland Road, and the Kingsland Road is near to where the Crays used to live. So it's over in the East End, great big long commercial road kind of thing. There used to be markets down there, lots of shops and that, and pubs. And the owner of one of these pubs was basically the local gangs were coming in, smashing up the place, hitting his wife, trying to attack him. All sorts were going on. I mean, he was quite a tough guy, the pub owner, bloke called Peck. And but there was too much of this going on, and it wasn't even like a protection racket where they were trying to have money and then we'll go away. They just wanted to go in there, drink, smash the place up, start fights and all this. So he got Hagen. How he met him, we don't know. And there's some suspicion on my part that someone in the police that might have been an ex-soldier may have known him. Because the police knew that this pub was a problem pub, not because of the owner, but because of where it was and the people that were going in there. And there were a couple of guys in particular called, I think it was Wheeler and Lambert, that would go in there. They were the gang leaders. And so the pub owner gets Hagen in, and he's a very dapper, very well-presented little guy, 5'7". So he wasn't that small for the time, but he wasn't huge. And they put him in the back room. And the idea was, if this gang started up, he would go in and help settle it down. So the pub owner goes upstairs to do something. His wife's at the bar. They kick off. The gang start throwing things at her. She screams out, "Who's going to help me?" Obviously the signal for Hagen. He comes out from the back, pushes the gang back to the other side of the bar as a confrontation to him. They kind of back down, but they're still there. Then he gets the pistol out and shows them the pistol. And it's like, okay, if you want some more, you can have some more. The landlady gets cold feet at that time, and she pushes him back into the back room so he's out of the way. She starts to get worried. She obviously didn't know he was armed. Anyway, it all starts up again with the guys out the front. She's hurried Hagen out. She's got him out through a back window because she thinks they're going to come after him and that's going to cause more trouble. They try and get in the pub. The pub landlord comes down, knocks one of them backwards, throws them out the pub. They go out the front door. He's gone out the back window. He's walking up the street. They see him walking up the street. So the gang go for him, run up the street after him. He turns round, pulls his pistol out, points it at them and tells them to stop. They don't stop. So he fires twice. Two of them go down. One of them shot clean in the head. The other one just goes down pretending to be dead because he's out of his depth. Gang still come on, so he fires off another shot, shoots another one through the head. This is all at about 30 feet, so it's a crack shot. Then goes off up the road. By this time, all chaos has broken out. Loads of people have come out, and all they know is there's a gunman on the loose, and there's various members of this gang that are whipping up these people to try and get him. So they run after him and they corner him. So he whips the gun out again. They've got him cornered, but he's saying, okay, if you want to take this further, we'll settle it now. And guy walks up who's an RSPCA inspector. And he tries to reason with Hagen, the gunman, and says, look, come on, this is madness. Get you away from here. You got to put the gun down. You got to hand yourself in. And he doesn't really want to know. But what he doesn't know is this RSPCA inspector is the brother of a bare knuckle boxing champion called Jack Nifton, it was called the 81 tonner. He was 6'2" and 230 pounds. So he was a
Wow.
monster. So the RSPCA guy obviously wasn't as big as his brother, but he was a fair old unit. So he manages to try and get the gun off him and grab hold of him, and he's going to try and get him to a police station. In the meantime, one of the gangs jumped in, and the three of them are wrestling on the floor trying to get the gun. A policeman eventually comes up, separates them all. I mean, this guy Hagen, because the crowd's set on him, he's half naked by now. He's had half his clothes pulled off. One of them's got a rope to hang him with. There's all sorts going on.
Oh my goodness.
So the RSPCA inspector and the copper, the RSPCA inspector probably saved his life by holding them off.
Yeah.
Him and the copper, get him in a hansom cab, get him down to the police station, and he says, yeah, I shot him. You know, they were coming after me, it's self-defence. He said, I just did what any self-respecting person in America would have done, and I dealt them the way they should have been dealt out. And he was a crack shot, so it wasn't chance that he killed them. Through the head, two of them, no problem. Anyway, he goes on trial. He gets found guilty, but all these people come forward giving him character references. So his old, you know, the colonel that ran his regiment comes forward and says how wonderful he was as a soldier. Even the police are kind of sticking up for him because they had so much trouble at this pub. And they said in court, once he'd done this, we've had no trouble since. So it's almost like there was a little bit of collusion going on. Anyway, he goes to jail, but he only gets a year. So he's a year in jail. I think he went to Maidstone jail. It was a massive court case at the time. And when he comes out, he's interviewed in the newspapers and he publicly thanks the jailers and the governor of the prison for treating him so well while he's been in prison. Because most of them were ex-forces. So they were ex-army themselves. They thought he'd done a good deed by breaking up this gang. And he would have gone into obscurity, but I tracked him after this. And what he did, he went back to America and he said he was an Irish miner, as in a coal miner, which he wasn't. He went over to America and he ends up in, I think it was Baltimore, where there's an Irish politician, a guy called Martin Lemesney, who was an ex-gang member who was running for like governor and this kind of thing. He was very powerful in the area, and there'd been a couple of attempts on his life. And Hagen was living in his ward and was meant to be a machinist, i.e., you know, working with metal on that. So perhaps manufacturing firearms or whatever. And it seemed to me every time there was a big shootout in Baltimore, Hagen would get on a ship and come back over to London and visit his brother who lived, I think it was in Barry Road in Dulwich or somewhere like that. And then he'd go back again. And he did this right up until the war. He was meant to be a clerk. He was meant to be a machinist. He was meant to be a miner, all these different things. And he was to and fro across the Atlantic. None of these jobs were well-paid jobs. To and fro across the Atlantic. And eventually the gangs were all broken up after the 20s. And at that point, he came home permanently to England and died peacefully in South London. So I think he was being used as a professional bodyguard by a forerunner of what would become like the Irish Mafia on the East Coast out there. Absolutely fascinating. But the Kingsland Road murder made every newspaper all over the world. It was massive news, and people were applauding this guy for shooting these two gang members. So to me, it's not a funny story, but it's an intriguing story because of the bits we can't prove, the bits that you can kind of speculate on. He's always there when there's trouble. He's always gone when the trouble breaks. This kind of thing. Who knows?
Well, I was asked by a friend of mine who is part of the travelling community if I would research his family tree. Now, if you ever have researched anybody from the travelling community's family tree, you'll know it's somewhat difficult because often, well, as in the case in this family, they didn't like to fill in official records. So you won't find them at all on a census record. However, newspapers were great for me. So this family was based in Chester in the middle of the Victorian period. And the family owned like a cab company in Chester. And this gentleman, he was called William. He was married and had quite a few children. But as well as being involved in the family business, he also had his own caravan where he would go touring with various different fairs. And he had like his own sort of shooting gallery. So he'd open his caravan and it'd like turn into a shooting gallery. And he spent more and more time away from his family. And eventually, him and his wife became estranged. But what was interesting for me, again, don't forget, I'm struggling here for records. I've got a newspaper, but that's about it. I managed to track him because every time he was baptizing his new child, that's right, he met another woman while on the road, right, would coincide to him being pulled up in the local court for basically deserting his first wife. So the two records, the baptisms and the court records, were always in the same place. And at one point, he actually goes back to Chester. I don't know where his new partner is and his new children, but his estranged wife and her sister are waiting for him to come trundling down with his horse and his caravan attached. And they jump out and they've got what we would think of today as like a baseball bat. And they break all the windows on his caravan and smash his caravan up. I don't know what quite happened after that. I think he left probably pretty sharpish, and he did actually remain with his second partner, and they did go on to marry. I suppose, loosely speaking, he was probably a bit of a bigamist.
Yeah.
I can't imagine he divorced his first wife, knowing how difficult it was and expensive it was to get a divorce at that time. But for me, the reason I've shared this story is not because it's a fantastic story. It was an interesting story that, the fact that these two women were not going to take this sort of desertion lying down. And, she was tracking him and pulling him in at every court she could. And also she decided her and her sister were going to smash the windows in of his caravan. But because of, I struggled with records. However, thinking a bit outside the box, court records, working in conjunction with baptism records helped me solve this case. But yeah, it was a really sort of fascinating case. But it was, there was a point where I thought, I just don't think I'm going to find anything on that side of the family. The other side of his travelling family was a bit more straightforward, but that one was really, really difficult.
And that's the thing, isn't it? And, well, the other thing is, people changing their names. I did some work with a guy recently. I won't go into the names, but basically he was trying to track down his father, and basically was born in the 1920s. And we knew he had a criminal record, so he knew he'd done a really good job himself in tracing this. And I got involved just to see if I could add anything to it, and there wasn't a lot I could add to it. He'd done such a good job, but this guy had so many aliases. I did manage to find at least one other alias that we didn't know he had, but he was turning up, and we had to go through so many different records. A lot of it was newspapers, obviously, always a good one, but you would find an alias in an official record. So there's a police gazette records, and they can be hard to get or they can be easy to get. To get police gazette records, you can't get them all in one place. It's really hard, and not all of them are digitised. You can get some at the British Library, you can get some in Ancestry, you can get them at Find My Past and other places, but they're really difficult and it's pot luck. If you find them, it's great because they give you a description of habitual criminals. So he was down as a habitual criminal, and it gave us an alias for him. And once we found that alias, I started putting things together to say, okay, so where was he coming up in court on that alias then? And you find all of that, and then all of a sudden, you find another court record. Just at the bottom of it, it says presenting as so-and-so and so-and-so with a different name. So if you just read the main record, it looks like he's using one of these known aliases. Then you get right to the bottom, and it's almost off the page. It gives a third alias that he was working under.
Mm.
And once we got that, it's like, oh, okay, so now we can find more stuff about him. So sometimes you have to jump from place to place. And if people want to use an alias, if the two things aren't brought together, so if they've never tried for anything and the alias doesn't come up or it's not in the police records, they could be anyone. You just don't know. But if you can tie it together, so things like the Police Gazette are great for tracking that. Habitual criminals, they'll give a description, because the idea was this would be for other policemen to read. So they could see it and they would know what these guys, mainly men, looked like, what their habits were, what they did for a living, and all that kind of stuff. And we used that to piece together this fantastic life story this guy had, which was, it was so dysfunctional, but he lived his whole life through criminality. And we don't know if he had other aliases as well. There's no way of telling. And he had forged papers. It's literally trying to go from one little hint to another to pull it all together. But fascinating if you can find a source.
That has been one of the biggest problems. I think I've mentioned Tucker to you, Borromeo, this guy that I've been researching for ages, and I've got a timeline. I've got him in Italy between 1822 to 1840. Wait for this timeline. Then I've got him in London in 1842. Sheffield, 1847. Preston, Belfast, Dublin, Sligo, Kilkenny, London, Newgate Prison, 1858. Lambeth Police Court, 1865. No idea from 1869.
Yeah.
I've been tracking this guy from all these different places. I think I'm on about 5 wives. Definitely must be at least 6 aliases. And because I've got no idea what he came at, I know he went to prison in 1865 and he came out in 1869. Because I've got no idea of his alias after that time, I know he wasn't using any of the ones he'd used before. I've got no idea what happened to him.
Yeah.
And I can't finish the book, Paul, till I know how it ends. I just don't know how it ends.
The only chance you got is DNA. And see if there's somewhere. But even then, you're relying on his particular descendants to have taken a DNA test. And if they didn't, that's that.
You know, don't get me wrong, he's an absolute scoundrel. But I'm just wondering, like, did he ever in the end fall in love? You know, because he clearly didn't love these women, right? I think that's pretty obvious from reading between the lines, you know. And he took them for every penny they owned. And there's just a bit of me that thinks, how did this end? You know, did he fall in love and have children, or did he die alone? You know, I just don't know how it ends.
The other source or sources I think are really useful are Army and Navy records, because they're all in one place. And if your ancestor broke the law or went AWOL or ran, as they say in the Navy, didn't get back on his ship in time, then that's all in one place and you can find it all, which is great. So you can go down, you can find people in the stockade, what they did, what they said to the sergeant, what they called him, whether they were using profanity, all sorts of things, whether they were verminous, if they had a sexually transmitted disease and were therefore put on a charge for making themselves unable to fight and this kind of thing. All sorts of stuff, all in one place. So that's great. You can find it in there. But there is one exception I found. And that exception is my Uncle Stan. So I've mentioned my Uncle Stan before. He was the Cockney Golden Highlander, so or Seaforth Highlander, I should say. So he was from Bermondsey, and he ended up in the Seaforth Highlanders. Was shipped out to Java to disarm the Japanese right at the end of the war. He ended up in that regiment because he'd gone AWOL, and then managed to turn back up again after travelling all the way down from Scotland to London to see his mum because he got bored. Went back up again. They put him in a stockade, stuck him in a kilt because the sergeant said he had nice legs, shipped him out to Java. The mistake they made was they gave him guard duty over the records office in Java. So he got all his records saying that he'd gone AWOL, etc., and destroyed the lot of them. So his records will never be found. And what happened years and years later, probably in about the 60s after the war, he said he was owed a pension from his war service and went to get his pension. And they said, we can't give you a pension because we don't have any of your records. And he said he was going to sue them, not that he ever was. He was going to sue them because they'd lost his records. In the full knowledge that
I love it.
He burnt them when he was in Java. So that was Uncle Stan.
Oh my goodness, Uncle Stan, you rogue. Thank you so much for being on the podcast again. The McNeil fan club will be very happy. And we shall see Paul again in another couple of weeks. I always let him have a week off because I know he's got a very busy schedule. He is giving talks all over the place at the moment. If you want to book Paul for a talk, because he is, let me tell you folks, very funny. It's not just genealogy, you get a bit of stand-up as well. You can do so via his website, which is timedetectives.wordpress.com.
That's it.
Yep, timedetectives.wordpress.com. Go and check out his website and show him some love. Paul, thank you very much for coming on. We shall see you again in a couple of weeks. Thank you to all our listeners. We have made a chart, one of those podcast charts. So thank you very, very much. Honestly, I really appreciate you listening. Paul, thank you. See you again in a couple of weeks. Cheers, mate.
Michala, bye.